Thanks very much, and I have to start with a small apology as well for David Pratt, the head of our team, who couldn't make it today. He asked me to step in. He failed to mention there would be quite such a big crowd, so bear with me. So my name is Milne. I'm a Senior Policy Officer with the Marine Planning and Strategy Unit. I've been working on the Sectoral Marine Plan for the past year, which will identify the spatial options for the next leasing round of offshore wind in Scottish waters. We're still fairly early on in that process, so this presentation will cover the marine spatial aspects that we've gone, or processes we've gone through to identify the areas of search. But first, I thought I should give you a very brief overview of Marine Scotland and our licensing consenting team. Okay, so Marine Scotland is a directorate of the Scottish Government, and we're responsible for managing Scotland's seas for prosperity and environmental sustainability. We've got roughly 700 members of staff. They can be split primarily into those categories of policy, licensing, and operations, science, and compliance. I'm sure I've missed somebody out there. The team I work in sits within the Planning and Policy Division, and we've got direct responsibility for national, sectoral, regional marine planning, marine conservation, renewable policy, and licensing and consenting operations. Our licensing consenting team, that's down there. Our licensing consenting team offers a one-stop shop for all licensing and consenting requirements for offshore wind and marine licenses in general, and other offshore renewable activity. We issue our consents under several legislative powers. So Section 36 under the Electricity Act allows us to give consent to construct and operate a development. Our marine licenses are issued under Marine Scotland Act 2010 and the Marine and Coastal Access Act 2009, and that's the actual license you need to deposit objects in the sea or affect the seabed in some way. And more recently, decommissioning plans now need to be approved by the Scottish ministers, so that previously wasn't devolved to Scotland but has moved into our responsibility, and our licensing team deal with that there. Our one-stop approach is designed to provide a single point of contact for the entire application process, from pre-application through to post-consent, and managing the consultation and engagement with stakeholders throughout that entire process. The licensing timeline in Scotland is fairly complex. I'm not going to go into much detail here. The point of bringing up that slide is to emphasize the lengthy and quite important pre-application stage, where any the pre-application stage is there to ensure that the environmental impact assessment that supports the application is fully formed and assessed before it becomes part of before it is formally accepted by Marine Scotland's licensing team. There's a gate check right at the end of that process to ensure that it's up to a standard that we would accept, and from there the timeline begins for an application. As I say, that is quite detailed, and I'm not an expert on the licensing side. So if you would like any information or any extra information about that, we've just recently updated our licensing and consents manual. It covers that entire process from application all the way through to the post-consent stages, and gives you an indication of the legislative requirements that we are working to. Excuse me. There's a link there on the website, but feel free to contact me afterwards or grab a card and I can pass it on. So the actual planning for offshore wind in Scotland follows a main route through our national and sectoral marine plans. Our National Marine Plan was published in 2015, and this sets out an overarching framework for all marine activities taking place in Scottish waters. At its core is a principle in favour of sustainable development and embedding environmental protection into the decision-making. It's a binding document for all public authorities making any decisions that affect the marine environment. The National Marine Plan itself, though, it's not spatial in nature, but the first policy for a renewables section defers to all commercial scale projects in Scotland for offshore wind and marine renewables should be located in the areas identified through our sectoral marine planning process. And it's that area that I work on, and I deal entirely, or mostly, with the spatial and technical aspects of the areas of search work and the assessments to follow. The sectoral marine plan itself is spatial in nature, and it looks to identify the preferred strategic locations for the sustainable development of offshore wind. So it does take a zoning approach or a marine spatial planning approach to identify the areas where development will will take place in the future, or could take place in the future. It's driven by a range of directives and requirements, including the EC directives for strategic environmental assessment, habitats, regulations, appraisal, public participation. We're also required to consider social and economic factors as part of the UK Marine and Coastal Access Act. And the output from that process will be fed back into the National Marine Plan and then becomes the areas, the plan options for a future leasing round in Scotland. Like the consenting process for the licensing team, this is quite an involved series of steps and processes. It can be broken down roughly into a few separate stages, 4 on this diagram. Primarily, we are to identify areas of search through a marine spatial planning approach. From those areas of search, draft plan options are identified, and they go forward for assessment through a sustainability appraisal, which includes the strategic environmental assessment, the habitats regulation appraisal, and the socioeconomic impact assessment. The results of that assessment and the draft plan options itself and the plan will be sent out for consultation for a minimum of 12 weeks. And then all going well, we would finalize and adopt that plan into government policy. As I mentioned, we're still very early on in this process, so we're at the top dashed line in the scoping consultation stage. So the next few slides are just describing the spatial analysis that I've undertaken to identify the areas of search that will move forward into that process, into the planning process. So it begins with a multi-criteria opportunity and constraint analysis that brings together multiple spatial data sources representing opportunity and resource as well as spatial constraints in the marine environment. So it includes things like shipping activity, fishing effort, helicopter routes, existing infrastructure on the seabed. We bring that all together using a weighted sum analysis, which the final output is the map you see there, or one of the maps you see there, which identifies lower and higher levels of constraint in our marine environment. Okay. So from there, we identify these broad areas of search, which primarily look to avoid constraint, the higher constraint that we've identified. And we use this then to start the stakeholder engagement and the engagement with consultees and NGOs about the areas of search that we're looking at. We then refine this down into a smaller set, a larger number, but a smaller set of areas of search. This is refined using a single issues analysis, which looks at primarily spatial information or known contentions for areas that we've identified through the constraint and opportunity mapping process. These now look to avoid the higher levels of constraint and also now avoid it creating new impact on the marine environment. However, it's important to note that as the government, we're not the commercial or specialists in offshore wind. So we don't include any technical or specialist information in this refinement process. When we consult on these, well, we have consulted on these, we asked an additional question for developers or any other stakeholders to provide any other information that they think we've missed, or that they think should be, or areas that should be included in the process going forward. And we ask for that information to come in so that we can further assess the areas of search before we move into the draft plan stage. So we consulted on these in summer last year, and those were the suggestions that came in through that consultation. So several developers were happy to share their areas of interest as long as it was anonymized. So that's the map you're seeing here. So this is an amalgamation of areas of interest from developers through our initial scoping consultation. Okay. So in addition to the areas you're seeing there, we also received some feedback on the data used in the opportunity and constraint analysis. And so my job for the last several months has been to address that feedback, address those comments, and examine the areas of search that have come through multiple processes. So Bringing that all together, I have rerun and updated the opportunity constraint analysis, which produces the map you're seeing here. And then, as you'll see, it's quite a complicated overlay of all the information that's been presented to us. So we've been running through an update to various data sets, various pieces of information and analysis on those areas. And that has resulted in a refinement or a revision to the areas of search, which we released just in 2019, just at the start of this year. So the process now for us to develop these areas to take forward into the actual planning process and consultation is to complete a risk analysis on each of the areas. We're doing this through our project board and steering groups. All of that information will then be provided to our ministers to make a final decision on which options go forward for consultation and assessment. And then we'll undertake the sustainability appraisal and consult on those in 2019. I'm aware that I've nipped through an awful lot of that in a short space of time. So I'm happy to take any questions, or these are my contact details if you have any further questions later on. Thank you very much.